Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to talk about the Crusades and their influence on Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries in particular. But I want to begin actually by taking a minor detour by talking about the Investiture Controversy, because we have to understand this controversy first in order to better understand the Crusades in general, but also to get an understanding of how the papacy's relationship with clerics, or sorry, with monarchs was changing in the 11th century. So Pope Gregory VII becomes Pope in 1073. And that is the same year that Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, he doesn't become emperor that year. He's been emperor since 1055, but he becomes old enough to rule by himself because regents had been governing in his name prior to this point. Gregory VII becomes Pope, and he is one of a number of reforming popes, Leo IX and Nicholas II before him, who are determined to reform the papacy. In particular, to do a couple of things. They want to bring in celibate marriage, all priests would be celibate. It had been practiced up until about 1,000 years that parish priests were not celibate. They did not conduct themselves in the same way as bishops and abbots. But he also wants to end lay investiture. What exactly is lay investiture? Well, that is basically the appointment of bishops and abbots. Today we take it for granted that the papacy is responsible for appointing bishops and abbots, etc., throughout the papal lands. But in the Middle Ages, bishops in particular and bishoprics were often appointed by political leaders. And they were done because these were bishoprics that had control of church taxes, church lands. They were actually positions of significant wealth and income, and actually they could be used both to reward a loyal supporter of a ruler, but also to be in a position of power to help further the power of that ruler as well. So Gregory is trying to end lay investiture in all his lands. This angers Henry VII, the Holy Roman Emperor, the Holy Roman Empire, essentially modern Germany, and it's going to lead to a clash between them. So Henry appoints the Bishop of Milan in direct contravention of Gregory's order that only the papacy should be allowed to invest people in the offices of a bishop. Gregory at first excommunicated some of the bishops who were involved in that installation, and when Henry responded by demanding that Gregory resigned, Gregory went ahead and excommunicated Henry IV from the Catholic Church. Now, a leader being excommunicated by the Catholic Church was not necessarily unheard of, and it was not necessarily a major thing, or at least it wouldn't have been a major thing if Gregory had not gone further. Not only did he excommunicate Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, from the Church, but he also said that because Henry was outside of God's living now, his subjects not only had a right but had a duty to rebel against Henry, and so he is raising the stakes significantly in order to put political pressure on him. But it really looks like Henry might lose his crown. This encouraged some of Henry's subjects to rebel against his political authority. And by 1077, it really seemed that some of his enemies were getting the upper hand, and that he might lose his crown, that he had held for 20 years at this stage. So he needs to make peace with Gregory. He needs to kind of debase himself, if you will, and to put forward an apology in order to get in Henry's good graces again. And so he does that. He comes to a place called Canossa, which is a territory in northern Italy. That's where Gregory VII is waiting. He goes to Canossa in 1077 and begs for forgiveness. Doesn't just beg for forgiveness. He stands outside barefoot for 3 days, stripped of all his imperial robes, merely wearing sackcloth. So the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, the mighty prince of all of Germany, is reduced to essentially being a pauper in sackcloth, standing outside a castle for 3 days, demanding forgiveness. And Gregory does forgive him in the end. And so we take a couple of things from the Investiture Controversy. It didn't actually fully resolve the conflict between them. Henry and Gregory actually were fighting again a couple of years later. Henry Henry IV drove Gregory out of Rome. The Holy Roman Empire at this stage controls large parts of Italy. He drove Gregory out of Rome in 1085, near the end of his life. But it marks a significant transfer of power from the monarchs to the papacy. That while while kings would continue to influence elections for bishops going forward, Gregory had gained the status that really the job of appointing bishops was first and foremost a pope's job. And so he claimed for the papacy not just the desire to show its efforts to reform, and we've talked about that at length in earlier classes as well. But it also showed that when it comes to appointing bishops, the Pope was the top man, and the Pope, further popes going forward, were to have a greater influence on appointing bishops and giving out bishoprics as a way, actually ironically, with a way of wielding further political power. That's the irony of this, is that they're trying to free themselves of worldly influence, but because they want that worldly influence for themselves. Gregory the Pope is Pope until in 10. I guess he dies in 1087, but another Pope is going to come along who's going to have a similar reforming desire as Gregory VII, and his desire for reform is going to have much more significant consequences for Europe in general in the late 11th century. Okay, so this would be where I would ask you in class what you know about the Crusades, and all of you would impress me with your very informed, very concise answers about the Crusades, and what a wonderful discussion we would have about the Crusades, from the First Crusade to the Ninth Crusade, and then there would be no need for me to carry on, because you guys would have known so much about the Crusades that we could have stopped there and then and called it a day. But unfortunately, because we can't do that in class, I'm going to have to go on and say a little bit about what the Crusades were about. Although first, we'll look at Ignorance is Blitz. The Crusades enlarged opportunities for travel. True. These were a series of military expeditions, so spelled, made by Christians seeking to free the Holy Land, which was the hometown of Christ. So there you go. The origins of the Crusade, ironically, actually start in the middle of Asia, with a group called the Seljuks, or the Seljuk Turks. So the Seljuk Turks were Turkic people, a nomadic people, and again, this is a pattern we've seen before, and we're going to see a little bit again. Nomadic peoples kind of coming in and conquering empires. So they were nomadic people, primarily based on horseback riding and military use of the horses, which gave them kind of a lot of advantages over their opponents. They converted to Islam, and during the course of the 10th century or the 11th century, so the 1000s, if you will, their power began to expand. So starting in, I guess, almost just to the north of India, in the central Turkic lands, they began conquering territory around them and expanding out from there. By 1055, they have captured Baghdad, so the Abbasid Caliphate has fallen to the Seljuk Turks instead. So understand, the Abbasid Caliphate has ruled in Baghdad for a couple of centuries, but it falls in 1055 to the Seljuk Turks. There's a new player in town, there's a new power in town, and they proclaim their own empire. The Seljuk Turks proclaim their own empire, and they continue expanding west. So they don't stop at Baghdad. They continue expanding west. And eventually they are going to come into collision with the Byzantines, which they do in 1071. So they invade Anatolia, which is basically modern Turkey, in 1071. And at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, they essentially annihilate the Byzantine army. They conquer almost all of Anatolia, and they bring their empire right up to the borders of Constantinople itself. So Constantinople, prior to this, had a large buffer area, had recaptured large areas of Turkey over the course of the 9th and 10th century. But now a new threat has emerged, the Seljuk Turks, who are knocking on the door again in 1071. The Byzantines had actually recovered considerable territory and had built in conjunction with the decline of the Abbasid Caliphate. In the 10th and the 11th centuries, they had actually expanded their own power. But now they find that the weakened Abbasid Caliphate has fallen and has been replaced by an aggressive, expansionist Seljuk Turkic Empire, which is determined to try and capture the city. In 1081, there's a new emperor, Alexis Comnenius, is appointed, or he emerges, I guess, as a victor in a struggle to in the Byzantine Civil War. There had been kind of division in Byzantine up until this point. Before 1081, Alexis Comnenius becomes the emperor, and he's able to at least stall the Turkish advance. He's able to marshal Byzantine forces. He's able to do some things to, particularly to stop debasing gold, something that had been weakening the Byzantine economy in the previous century or so. He's able to shore up the Byzantine defenses, but he's certainly not able to reclaim the land in Anatolia that the Seljuk Turks are now occupying. So the danger very much remains. He kind of offers a temporary respite to the danger, or I guess the threat of Constantinople falling recedes in the short term, but the long-term danger of having the Seljuk Turks on their very doorstep very much continues. And Alexis was also involved in fighting against, especially against Normans, in Greece. And in 1085, he saw a Greek army that was defeated by the heavy horse Norman knights who came to fight a battle, because the Normans at this stage were expanding into southern Italy and Greece. So we think of the Normans obviously as living in northern France, but they expanded across the Mediterranean during this time period as well. Alexis saw some of their heavy horses in action. Unfortunately, to his point, they were the opponents in 1085. But he had a major idea. He thought these heavily armored knights would do wonderfully well in battle against the pretty lightly armed Seljuk Turks. He saw two different styles: the lightly armored Seljuks and the heavily armored Norman knights. Two groups fighting on horseback with very different approaches. And he figured that the heavily armored knights of the Normans would essentially defeat the Seljuk Turks with ease. So he begins to formulate a plan to go west to ask the Pope Urban II, for some assistance. And Alexis's idea of assistance is that he'll get a few thousand Norman knights, come back and defeat the Seljuks, expand, I guess, into Anatolia, create a bit of breathing room for Constantinople, and then things can go back to as they were before. However, in making his appeal to Urban II, he strikes a number of chords with Urban, who is looking to kind of stamp his own authority on the papacy, to find ways to extend essentially the political power and the independent power of the papacy. So Alexis makes this appeal to Urban II. Urban is all ears. He has a very different project in mind, and it's from that starting point that we get the origins of the Crusades. So the first thing I want to show you here is the Seljuk territories in Anatolia, which is today modern Turkey. And they call this area particularly the Sultanate of Rum. And I'm wondering, could you tell me why they called it the Sultanate of Rum? And the answer is, because we don't have time obviously for questions, is that the Sultanate of Rum was a reflection of, in fact, Rome. That this was an echo of, again, Constantinople. They saw Constantinople as essentially the heir of Rome. So by calling it the Sultanate of Rum, they were really saying, well, this is Rome. And not only are they saying it, but they actually want to claim the mantle of Rome for themselves. So again, this just shows us the power of Rome, the everlasting power of Rome, that even 1,000 years after it declined in the East, even the Islamic Seljuk Turks are still willing to put the mantle of Rome upon themselves as a way of giving their rule further legitimacy and authority. Okay, so answering the call. So Alexis goes to Pope Urban II and he asks for an army. We'll say a relatively small army, a few thousand soldiers. Alexis has a very specific military and political goal in mind. He wants to take Norman knights in particular, to bring them east, to fight the Seljuks in Anatolia, to liberate Anatolia, and then they'll essentially go home. Maybe he'll maintain some to preserve power, but it's a specific, limited military objection. Urban II, however, has a very different plan. So once Alexis approaches him, he sees this as an opportunity for a number of things, and you have to understand Urban II's position in light of the wider effort to reform the papacy in the late 11th century. Pope Urban II, he's trying to follow in the legacy of Gregory VII and Leo IX. He wants to be a reforming pope. He wants to essentially make the papacy a political power, like and equal to the King of France or the King of England. And in order to, again, and it's somewhat ironic, of course, that he's trying to do this while trying to reform the papacy, because we tend to think of the papacy being involved in political affairs as being unreformed, I guess. But Gregory is very much the opposite. Urban is the opposite, in that he believes that by being an independent power upon the political landscape of Europe, the papacy can maintain its own independence and its own kind of entitlement to views on a wide range of issues, as opposed to being beholden to the powers of the Holy Roman Emperor and whatnot. So firstly, he sees this call for arms as not just an effort to help Alexius, but also an effort to kind of revamp how people view the papacy in Europe. And again, he doesn't just want it to be an effort to help the Byzantines. He wants actually to, by going east, by showing these kind of Byzantines what's what, by imposing Western military conquest upon the East. He is also hoping to show, firstly, the superiority of the Western way of life over the Eastern way of life. And when I'm saying the Eastern way of life here, I mean the Byzantines as opposed to the Seljuk Turks. But he also wants to end the schism between the Eastern and Western Church. The Eastern and Western Church had separated only about 50 years before, had formally separated, gone their own ways, and he is hoping to kind of end that schism and bring the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, back into the fold under, of course, the supremacy of the papacy as well. So he sees multiple opportunities that aren't really related to what Alexis is calling for at all in the call for send more soldiers. So in France, in Clermont in 1095, Pope Urban issues an appeal. But he doesn't just ask for knights to help Alexis. He asks for a crusading army to form up, and not to actually liberate Anatolia from the Seljuks, but to go and take Jerusalem itself. Now, Jerusalem had been captured by the Seljuks in 1071, captured it from the remains of the Abbasid Caliphate. Not the Abbasid Caliphate, had the Fatimid dynasty, which ruled in Egypt. But it had been in Muslim hands for a long time. He sets that as the goal. Jerusalem, the Holy Land. That is what people are going to be aspiring to, not Alexis's call for help in fighting in Anatolia. So he totally reimagines what Alexis is looking for help for and what his limited goals are. And in doing so, he kind of turbocharges the European response to this call, because it's actually phenomenal. Firstly, Urban says that anyone who goes on crusade will have there is immediate remission of their sins. Another goal, actually, I should have said this earlier, another goal of Urban was the peace movement. At this time in the 11th century, there was a big goal to essentially remove a lot of the infighting that took place in Western Europe, because you have these societies that essentially have too many knights and too many men at arms that are constantly fighting with one another over the scraps of what their lords will kind of let go. Urban sees this as an opportunity. Well, why not take that kind of restless spirit that exists amongst the knights of Europe and export it? And they will, one, be fighting for a good cause. Two, some of them won't come back, and that's not a bad thing either, because it'll thin out the kind of ranks of over exuberant knights that exist in Europe at this time. And in order to entice them to do this, he promises that you can go essentially and pillage and plunder, and you will be absolved of your sins. And if you die on crusade, you'll be immediately absolved of all your sins. Urban actually said you'd be absolved of your sins that you did on crusade. But others went further. Others said you'd be absolved of all your sins, pre and post crusade, as well as during the crusade as well, if you died while answering the call, or taking up the cross, as it were, taking up the cross to free the Holy Land. And this is a very powerful motivation in a society that is much more religious, of course, than we are today. And many knights would have had guilty consciences about things they would have done in their past. So the idea that they get absolution for all of this while fighting and pillaging and engaging in the behavior they love to engage in at the same time was too much of a good deal to pass up. And the response is simply enormous. Again, Alexis was expecting an army of a couple of maybe 4,000 or 5,000 knights. That would have been ideal for him. Within a year, there is over 100,000 people from across Europe on the march to the east, seeking seeking essentially to answer Urban's call for a crusade. And this has certainly exceeded Alexis's dreams. Probably actually means his worst nightmare. But in making his call, Pope Urban II has in a very short time radicalized Christian Europe and sent it on a mission to try and reclaim the Holy Land. So Pope Urban had issued the call in 1095 for the crusade to take place. And the idea was that in about a year, in August of 1096, the Knights of Europe would come together, form an army, and go across Europe into the Holy Land. But kind of once Urban had issued this call, it took on a life of its own, and there were certainly thousands of peasants and also even low-ranked knights who wanted to go on crusade as well, who believed that many of the hardships of life was kind of miserable anyway. Why not abandon the hardships of day-to-day existence in Western Europe, go on crusade, have your soul saved, take part in the reconquest of the Holy Land. So an army of about 40,000 or so French, German and Italian peasants had begun to form and actually set off on its own crusade prior to the arrival of the main crusade. And in fact, we can distinguish here between the People's Crusade, which was the peasants and the low-ranking knights and various other kind of odd people basically around Europe, and the Prince's Crusade, which was much more about the kind of wealthy lords, and the Prince's Crusade was much better funded, much better organized. But the People's Crusade actually departed first. So under the leadership of Peter the Hermit. So Peter the Hermit was an 11th century preacher, and he claimed to be preaching on the authority of, actually, frankly, the authority of Jesus Christ himself. And some people even rumored he had a letter to prove he had Christ's, and how exactly they were supposed to believe that Christ had written a letter and he had a copy of it, I don't know. But he was in charge of recruiting people, and actually a lot of these peasants thought that Peter, rather than Urban, was the actual head of not of the Catholic Church, but certainly the person who had the original idea to go on crusade. So an army of 40,000 or so rally behind Peter the Great. They begin to head themselves east to free the holy city themselves before the better organized, the wealthier knights and lords can organize themselves. Marching to Constantinople through Germany and through Hungary, they actually cause a great deal of harm and carnage. In Germany, they engage in massacres of Jews. And this should be borne in mind that in medieval Catholic or medieval Christian thinking, the Jews were responsible for essentially the crucifixion of Christ. And never mind that the crucifixion of Christ was actually essential from theological reasons for the salvation of all of mankind. But they were resentful of the Jews and they began massacring them. There was one massacre of 800 Jews in Nuremberg, another of 1,000 in Munich. This was in Germany. This is not anywhere near the Holy Land. They continue into Hungary, where they get in a dispute with the Hungarians there. They get in a fight outside of one town in particular, and end up killing 4,000 people in that town. And then they finally manage to get to Constantinople. There's also some kind of disagreements with some people around the city of Belgrade. So they're able to make their way eastward, somewhat chaotically, rampaging the countryside as they travel, and not really able to come up with a kind of coherent single leader. Peter the Great is their overall leader, But in a kind of disorganized, chaotic army such as this, a number of other leaders also begin to kind of emerge, and they have different differences about where the crusade should go and what it should kind of its main focus should be. They finally reach Constantinople, and Alexis doesn't really know what to do with them. This was not what he was expecting. He was expecting a fully organized, professional, smaller army. Instead, he gets 40,000 kind of some knights, but certainly some ordinary people as well who didn't have that much combat experience. And historians debate about whether Alexis essentially rids his hands of the People's Crusade, ferries them across the Bosphorus as soon as he can to be rid of them, or whether he had tried to warn Peter the Hermit and others, look, you guys should wait for the more organized crusade to catch up, because you guys alone are not going to be able to defeat the Seljuks. So we're not sure about what exactly his position was, but he did ferry them across into Anatolia, and essentially they were massacred. They tried to attack the town of Nicaea. In fact, they get a rumor that some of the Germans in the army had actually captured Nicaea. They rush into Nicaea to participate in the looting, rather than understanding that actually it's a trap, that the Seljuk Turks have not only not conceded Nicaea, but actually are waiting for them on the road. They ambush the People's Crusade, cut off. Many of them are forced to drink their own urine, or drink blood from their donkeys, because they're actually cut off from their water supplies. This is a very parched landscape, and many of the People's Crusade are slaughtered. So in the very first kind of battle they come across against the Seljuk Turks, it's an absolute rout, and the Seljuk Turks are victorious. And so with the People's Crusade kind of pushed aside, the wait is now going on for the Prince's Crusade, the more organized crusade, to follow up and to see if they can succeed where the People's Crusade failed, and to take the Holy Land. So the People's Crusade was a disaster, but the Prince's Crusade was a much better organized, much better financed expedition, and that set off in late summer of 1096. So aside from Peter's army, we have four large armies, mostly consisting of knights. This is unlike Peter's crusading army. This is the upper crust of European society, and it amounts to maybe as many as 10,000 men, 100,000 men. It's four large armies. One is headed by a guy called Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, Baldwin of Boulogne, and Bohemond of Taranto, and his nephew Tancred as well. So there are a variety of different, especially of Norman French leaders of knights who are part of this force, who in the late summer 1096 begin the slow expedition eastward in answer to Urban's call. And so the question we might have is, why would someone go on crusade? What are the motivations someone would have to go on crusade? So, as we already discussed, many of these knights were really exhibiting true religious fervor and piety. It should be noted that really this expedition was a fool's errand, to go so far from home, and to go to a territory that's completely uncharted in terms of the Holy Land, to fight an enemy you know nothing about, really was very, very dangerous. And many of the knights who went were very eager to demonstrate their piety, their absolute devotion and faith in God. And so that is the absolutely overriding motivation for many of these guys, especially once the call to go on crusade goes around. It kind of sparks, in some ways, it sparks a social movement, but it also sparks a fervor which people were kind of surprised by, and which these knights in particular represent their willingness to go and fight, and if to die, so be it. But of course, they also believe that their sins will be absolved as well. So that is certainly a major motivation for some in going on crusade. Hand in hand, so as well as their love of God, of course, there's also the hatred of other people. The desire to punish the enemies of Christ is also quite high, and it's not just confined to the Seljuks in Jerusalem itself. It's open to anyone who's considered potentially an enemy of Jesus Christ, and for that reason, that these massacres on the Jews in Germany in particular continue. Maybe a little less intensity than they were organized under Peter the Hermit and his People's Crusade, but they continue with the Prince's Crusade as well. The Jews, of course, are the enemies of Christ, or at least they're viewed as the enemies of Christ, and they are to be punished as a result. But it also means that when the Crusaders go and start conquering cities in the Levant, the area around the Eastern Mediterranean, there's not going to be any mercy shown for Jews or Muslims that they capture in this expedition. Some knights, frankly, were motivated by were on hard times and were motivated by financial gain. Obviously the idea that, especially, there was a kind of the upper level kind of knights saw an ambitions to found kingdoms or principalities, and to kind of, in a way that their ability to do that in Western Europe was kind of blocked by people in position and in place. Their way in the Eastern Mediterranean, these are, if they can conquer some of these lands, they can establish a powerful base and a powerful kingdom for themselves. Lesser down the social ladder, maybe knights didn't have their own ambitions to have their own kingdom, but certainly some hope to benefit financially from this vast undertaking and to gain a piece of property and some money in this for themselves. And then, of course, there was the European kings. They were happy to have an excess of knights off their hands. Basically, that they want to get some of the infighting that takes place in these European countries, they believe, is caused by an excess of knights. So they hope that these guys will go overseas and that some of them won't, frankly, come back. They hope to do kind of kill two birds with one stone, to serve the cause and get these knights kind of conquer Jerusalem, and that'll be great. But if some of these knights also don't come back, either because they're killed or they set up base overseas in the Holy Land instead, that is also working. So there's a variety of different motivations taking place amongst different players at the outset of this crusade.